water, extraordinary water, in Leatherwood Creek in northwestern Arkansas. A great city on the banks of Leatherwood Creek, born not of gold or silver, but of healing water, extraordinary water. A great railroad carried health seekers to that healing water, to that extraordinary water.
Board for Eureka!
The Ozarks were remote and unexplored when Dr. Alva Jackson hunted in these mountains in 1856. He happened upon a basin carved into a rock into which spring water flowed. Dr. Jackson came to believe that the water had the power to cure illness. The Ozarks were still remote and peaceful in 1879 when Dr. Jackson brought Judge L.B. Saunders to the Basin Spring to be cured. Judge Saunders moved into a small house here in May, but could not keep a secret. By July, over 400 people were camped here. On the 4th of July, the judge's son suggested the name Eureka, a Greek word meaning, "I have found it." In the days before modern medicine, people with no other hope moved into homes built under the rocks to be cured by water. Streets and 1,500 lots were laid out, as well as reservations around the springs. An estimated 10,000 people were living here by 1880, and the beginnings of a town were forming. The Eureka Springs Railway was chartered by General Powell Clayton in that same year. Eureka Springs would never become a national health spa without a railroad. The 18-mile line was completed in February of 1883 and connected with the Frisco Railroad at Seligman, Missouri. In November, the Eureka Springs Business District burned to the ground. This disaster actually aided in the reconstruction of Eureka Springs as a great city. The pre-dawn stillness blankets the Eureka Springs and North Arkansas Railway. Reconstruction of the original railroad to Eureka Springs. Sunrise finds the firemen preparing the locomotive for the day's work. Much lubricant is needed. Steam locomotives are yesterday's reliable engines of commerce. They are fondly remembered as the romantic machine on which every young boy wished to work. Today's passengers arrive on the rubber-tired trolley or in automobiles. The steel-wheel trolley car and the elegant horse-drawn coaches have long since vanished. Early arrivals can examine the many interesting exhibits in the railroad yard, machinery of a long-gone age. Steam tractors, compressors, and locomotives testify to the importance of steam in the commerce of yesteryear. The depot stop signal reminds passengers that their train will soon arrive. The most common steam locomotive ritual was taking water. This locomotive's tender holds oil for the fire and 2,500 gallons of water from which the steam is created. The tender must be filled twice each day with water from the Ozarka Spring, that same healing water that created Eureka Springs. Water tanks once were common sights along railroad tracks. They could be filled slowly from a spring or other source, but made to empty quickly into the tender of a thirsty steam locomotive. The same spring water that fills today's locomotive was commercialized and barreled, then bottled and finally shipped in railroad tank cars to the entire country under the Ozarka name. After quenching its thirst, our locomotive backs out onto the main line to wait for passengers at the station.
All aboard!
Passengers board in anticipation of an enjoyable trip. After all are aboard, they're astonished to see the locomotive uncouple and leave their train. The locomotive is on the wrong end of the train. It must be turned around and coupled to the other end. Running around the train is the easy part. The locomotive and its tender must then be turned end for end on a turntable. This locomotive was built in 1906 by the American Locomotive Company in Paterson, New Jersey. It is a foreign traveler. Its first job was to help build the Panama Canal. After returning to the United States, its wheels were moved inwards on its axles 3.5 inches to run on standard gauge track with 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rails. It originally burned coal, but now burns recycled waste oil carried in a 1,300-gallon tank in its tender. Steam locomotives are turned because most are designed to run much better forward than backward. A turntable must be strong to hold and turn a massive steam locomotive. This turntable weighs 75 tons and is 75 feet long. It is turned by an electric motor. The original Eureka Springs Railway once had a turntable near this spot. Steam locomotives can be designed to burn almost anything. Very old locomotives burned wood, but such locomotives are now rare. This wood-burning locomotive can be recognized by its cabbage stack, designed to prevent burning embers from setting the countryside on fire. Eureka Springs streets were improved, flowers planted, and stone retaining walls built. Construction started on the Crescent Hotel, and it was opened with a grand ball in 1886. This 5-story, 100-room hotel was constructed on a magnificent mountaintop park. Its conveniences included gas lights, central heating, an elevator, a billiard room, and a bowling alley. The 50-room Southern Hotel once stood just south of Basin Spring. Other hotels were built, and Eureka Springs became a beautiful city, as elegant as any back east. Bridges connected some streets, and phones were installed to connect the hotels with the stables. Horses were important to the visitors. 6 trains arrived each day, and horse-drawn vehicles carried their passengers to the hotels. Vehicles called tally-hoes took visitors through the streets of Eureka Springs to tour the beautiful Ozark countryside. Others preferred riding horses through the mountains or riding less spirited animals. Many homes were built, and by the turn of the century, Eureka Springs had 5,000 residents and a great many transient health seekers. Large, beautiful homes adorn the city, as well as smaller homes just as attractive. The Palace Bathhouse and Hotel opened in 1901 with the glow of electric street lights illuminating the town at night. In the next year, construction of the Basin Park Hotel began. Residents watched it grow month by month until completed 1 year later. The new hotel included an elevator and a large lobby. Public rooms were first class. Guests could order water from any of the many springs in the area or be entertained by a game of billiards. Our train leaves Eureka Springs for a trip through history to Junction, Arkansas. In 1981, Bob Dorch and his family began to rebuild the railroad. Nothing was left except the old depot. 1 mile of track was laid and 2 bridges built. Fares started at 25 cents and increased to 50 cents as the ride became longer. Since the old railway to Eureka Springs was removed 20 years previously, all the locomotives, railroad cars, and other equipment was trucked through Eureka Springs' winding streets. The next year saw the trains arrive at Junction. Dinner trains began feeding delighted visitors in 1984. The following year, both the turntable at Eureka Springs and the Y at Junction were completed, enabling locomotives to be turned around at both places. Minnie Ball Mountain, near the railroad, was the site of a Civil War reenactment. Many Civil War skirmishes occurred near Eureka Springs. Dr. Jackson had once used healing water from Basin Spring to treat Civil War injuries.
Carbondale, Illinois. Welcome to Eureka Springs.
By 1891, Eureka Springs had a street railway system. The cars were electrified in 1899. The track began near Basin Park and continued past Harding Spring. The tracks diverged, and one branch took the tiny trolleys to the depot where they met the big steam trains of the Eureka Springs Railway. The other branch continued up Spring Street to the assembly grounds and the summer auditorium. The tracks left the street to climb to the Crescent Hotel and finally ended some distance away on White Street. Our excursion train arrives at Junction. After the original railroad was extended to Harrison, Arkansas, Eureka Springs found itself on a 2-mile-long branch that connected with the main line at Junction. Our locomotive will again uncouple from its train and turn around on an arrangement of track called a Y. Years ago, our train could have continued to Joplin, Missouri in this direction. The locomotive backs out onto a trestle where the fireman will blow down, clearing the boiler of impurities. Until 1949, our locomotive might have continued in this direction for hundreds of miles to Helena, Arkansas. Our locomotive has almost reached the place where it first arrived at Junction, but is now turned around, facing Eureka Springs. Next, it will back onto the other end of its train.
The original railroad was called the Missouri and North Arkansas Railroad. It ran 369 miles from Joplin, Missouri to Helena, Arkansas. That's on the Mississippi River below Memphis, Tennessee. It was also called the May Never Arrive Railroad.
In the early days of railroading, coupling required the brakeman to stand between the cars. This dangerous procedure ended with the invention of knuckle couplers that automatically join. The brakeman signals the remaining distance to the engineer so that the coupling can be made gently. After the locomotive couples onto its train, the brakeman will connect the air hose that allows the engineer to control the train's brakes. And the bands did play on. Eureka Springs was always a social town with band concerts among the many activities scheduled at Basin Spring Park, the Summer Auditorium, and the new Opera House. Visitors often entertained themselves, and musicals, poetry readings, and theatrical productions were enjoyed. Hope for a cure seemed to put everyone in good spirits. Eureka Springs was a stylish town, a town where the well-off showed their finery at many social events. Even picnics and country outings saw well-dressed participants. Groups of visitors to the 40 hotels joined together for their own merriment, and the Tourist Social Hour Club was formed, composed entirely of visitors. Young people were not forgotten, as this group of picnickers attests. Then, as now, parents found Eureka Springs ideal family entertainment. Water was and is part of the enchantment of the Ozarks. The Narrows was a deep rock cut near Beaver, and special trains would carry passengers here from Eureka Springs every 4th of July for picnics and fireworks on the banks of the White River. Parades added to the excitement of a town already brimming with activity. A parade for presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan entertained residents in the shadow of the Crescent Hotel. Of course, everyone enjoyed the pleasant breezes of an Ozark summertime, and a waterfall made a great destination for a walk. They picnicked among the Ozark forest or simply walked through the woods and visited over 60 springs in and near town. The manufacture of walking sticks was once a substantial industry. Rides to the Ozark Hills on the elegant tally-hos were replaced with excursions in automobiles. Eureka Springs has always valued the fine arts, and a unique bridge once housed studios for artists. Our train whistles off for Eureka Springs. Trains are especially fascinating to children. Guests arrive at Eureka Springs after an enjoyable trip. Fewer people believed in natural cures, and Eureka Springs' population began to decline. The Crescent Hotel was forced to become Crescent College for women during the winters. The railroad bought gasoline motor cars, which were less expensive to operate than steam trains. Here, one of those motor cars carries recent Crescent College graduates. By 1920, the wonderful little trolley car ceased operation, but the automobile was now bringing visitors to enjoy the pastimes of the Ozark Mountains. buses arrived and fewer people traveled by train. The elegant new stone depot built in Eureka Springs in 1913 stood empty most of the time. Even the tally-ho was motorized as horse-powered travel became rare. In 1901, the railroad completed an extension to Harrison, Arkansas. This was the first of many construction projects that would create a 360-mile-long railroad from Joplin, Missouri to Helena, Arkansas on the Mississippi River. It was hoped that hardwood lumber and manufactured items, as well as zinc and lead mines, would provide revenue. Revenues were never sufficient, and the railroad went through a succession of bankruptcies and new names. Accidents, labor strikes, and floods added to its woes. Much of this railroad was removed in 1949, and trains to Eureka Springs ceased operating in 1960. Few would guess that trains would return just 21 years later.
First call to dinner aboard the Eureka Springs and North Arkansas Railway. All aboard.
Step back in time and enjoy the romance of dinner in the diner. Relive the era of great train travel with an elegant and sumptuous meal at a leisurely pace through the Arkansas countryside. Once, movie stars, presidents, and the very wealthy traveled on the most luxurious trains. Those trains are no more, but enjoy a little bit of what it must have been like by dining on the Eureka Springs and North Arkansas Railway. Meanwhile, our train has ambled through the Arkansas woodlands to reach the Y at Junction, where it will make way for the steam-powered excursion train. Baked Alaska in the shape of a steam locomotive completes a wonderful meal and starts the return to Eureka Springs. Often missing from our fast-paced lives, elegance is still found in northwestern Arkansas.